Hello and welcome to episode 15 of season 2 of LogiCast. I'm Carl Robinson, CEO and co-founder of Logicata, and I'm joined as always by my colleague John Goodall. How are you doing today, John?
I'm okay. I'm warm. It's warm in the shed today.
Spring is definitely springing in the UK. The sun is shining. That's what we like to see. We're also joined today for the first time by a very special guest, fellow AWS community builder, Johannes Koch. How are you doing today, Johannes?
Hey, doing great, Carl. Thanks a lot for having me on the show, and it's a great honor to be the first one.
You're very welcome. So tell us a bit about yourself, Johannes. Why are you here? Why do we think you might know a bit about AWS?
Oh, that's too much good things about me right before the starting, right? So I don't know if I know much about AWS, right? But I'm a community builder. I started last year, so I'm the program that you both are as well. Besides being in the community active, also as a YouTuber and a blogger, I'm also working as a DevOps engineer in an American company, in an American organization. We are building a platform for analytic decisioning, and I'm part of that platform team as well. Yeah, and I've been in the community for quite a while, so I'm also helping to organize the AWS Community Day in Germany, right? Where, by the way, the call for papers is still open, and we're also actively looking for sponsors. So, Carl, maybe if you have a few dollars left, we're going to take them as well. But yeah, I'm deep into the program, and it's really fun to meet people like you and get to know you.
Great. Thanks for that intro. And
I'm taking all of his spare dollars. They're mine.
Well, what I was thinking is we had offered a bribe of some swag for Johannes coming onto the podcast. So maybe instead of sending a T-shirt, we can send you a few dollars towards the community day. I'm not sure how much that's going to help, but
Yeah, but you can also sponsor the T-shirts for all of the attendees, right? So that's another option as well.
Do we get our logo on there? If we get our logo on there, then
of course.
yeah. Okay, well, let's talk afterwards. Okay, well, so we're not here to broker deals for AWS Community Day Germany. We are here actually to talk about AWS news. So as you know, if you listen to the podcast once a week, I collate a list of AWS news, which I send out via my AWS News Roundup newsletter. And then John and I pick a subset of those articles that we would like to talk about. And this week, we're also going to talk about them with Johannes. So the first of those articles is from one of our favorite news sites, InfoQ, and it's by AWS hero Renato Losio, and it's about a new service called Amazon VPC Lattice, which is now going into general availability with new capabilities for service-to-service connectivity. So, John, tell us a little bit about VPC Lattice.
Well, we touched on this when it was announced at reInvent, but the short version is it's kind of like a service mesh, but for within VPCs and for across VPCs and all that kind of thing. So you typically find service meshes in things like Kubernetes, Istio being the example, where it just makes communication between things a lot easier. You don't have to muck around with all the routing and all that kind of thing. VPC Lattice is sort of doing the same thing, but for within your AWS account. And if you dig past the article and into actually looking into what VPC Lattice is, the idea is it sits in the same family as that non-VPN connection thing, whatever that's called. So you've got better security options and simplified networking and all the rest of it, so that your engineering types don't have to spend quite so long on the networking and can just kind of get on and build stuff. That's sort of the idea. But here it's gone GA, so it's come out of the first iteration, and there's been a few changes, as you'd expect. They've come out with a pricing model now, which is always the first thing they do before it goes in preview. It's free. It goes to GA. There's pricing, because they've got to make money somewhere. It's not cheap. It's not expensive. And as ever, it's not available in every region because it's a brand new service. So right now we've got Ohio, Northern Virginia, Oregon Island, and Singapore. If you want to spend a lot of money, you can put it on in Singapore. But finance shops can't use this because it's not in London or Munich or wherever, because it's like, we must stay in this region. SOS can't, because it's only in a couple of other places. But yeah, that's the TLDR. I don't know how much I can actually talk about this because it's a little bit outside of my area. So, Johannes, I don't know if you've got anything to say.
Well, I'm not sure, but let's start with talking about Renato, who actually lives in Berlin, as you might not know. So I met him at the summit last year. He's a great person as well. So about Lattice, right? I think the most interesting thing here will be, can I use it to actually make my connectivity a little bit simpler? Right. So if I'm able to secure applications, web application, or any other kind of applications by using Lattice and then integrating with organizations and single sign-on, right? Then this might be a cool thing because it could replace third-party solutions like Zscaler or endpoint protection services that you guys have, right? I don't have experiences with using it either, but maybe that's an opportunity to use it. I don't know.
That's an interesting point, actually, because the article does go on to talk about the costs, and there's a number of people quoted in there that are kind of contrasting it with other AWS services and pointing out that it's more expensive. But actually, if you're going to be able to retire some third-party services, then potentially that's where a cost saving could come in. I guess the whole purpose of this is it's simpler than cobbling together a bunch of already existing AWS services. Perhaps that's why AWS are charging a bit more for it, because, as always, they're taking some of the heavy lifting away.
There's probably an element of that, I think. It's private link. That's the thing. It says it in the article. That's the other thing. And there's my cat's tail again. Morning. That happens every week. Go away. Go over there. So yeah, it's private link. And again, it's in the same kind of category. It's in the same sort of pricing model. So it's not cheap, but it's not horrific. And I think it sits in the we need everything to be in AWS sort of space. So, I mean, CI/CD tools is a great example of this. You know, GitHub, GitLab are generally better than things like Code Commit, Code Pipeline. But if you need to stay in AWS's ecosystem, you're kind of stuck with them. So this feels like that a little bit.
I think you're just trying to trigger Johannes there with those comparisons of CI/CD services. But I think he might have frozen for a bit, so maybe you made him so mad with that comment that he decided to drop off the call. And yeah, I was just saying, Johannes, that John perhaps triggered you with those comments about CI/CD services, and then you disappeared. So
yeah, I think I warned you about that. My endpoint protection somehow decided to restart overall, right? So that's strange. Now the CI/CD services didn't trigger me, right? I think the more that you need to invest into getting them into working, the harder it is, right? And I'm not yet understanding how Lattice simplifies that stuff for you, right? So reading the announcements, reading the GA, reading the article, right? For me, it's directly not clear how I will benefit from it, but I know that a lot of people were very excited about it when it got announced. So as you said, John, it's the first iteration of a service, right? We'll need to see where AWS wants to go with it, what they want to actually do, and what they're aiming for. And maybe that's not yet 100% clear to us at the moment.
Cool. Well, watch this space for further announcements and perhaps some case studies and some use cases on VPC Lattice. Let's skip on to the next article for discussion this week. And this one is about modernizing and moving towards a cloud native future. So the title of the article is Modernizing Containers Are Not Enough. You Need Cloud Native. Interestingly enough, this is on the Cloud Native Now website. So what else would they be talking about other than cloud native? But I guess this is a kind of an extension of the old discussion of moving your VMs to the cloud is not really cloud. Once you're there, you then need to think about how you're going to modernize and leverage some of those true cloud native technologies. So some people think moving their VMs to the cloud and then putting everything in containers makes it cloud native, but that's obviously not the case. So the article goes on to talk about a number of steps to sort of move beyond containers to cloud native. So what are your thoughts on this one, John?
There's a whole Dilbert cartoon about this, wasn't there?
There was one about Kubernetes.
Yeah, it's that one. It is that one. Yeah. You can't just say technical words and expect it to do magic. Kubernetes.
Yeah.
It's an interesting one. It's a bit of a clickbaity headline. I don't like that word, but that's kind of how it feels. It's you need to do this. Containers are not inherently cloud native, but they're not. suitable for cloud, right? Putting a VM in the cloud is not cloud native. It's just using AWS as a data center instead. Containers can be, because they can run serverlessly, Fargate being the thing you use to do that in AWS. I don't know what the others are called, but so they can be. Containers can be part of a microservices architecture, because in certain cases, you might have something that runs longer than the Lambda 15-minute limit, or it might not be suitable for a step function, or you might not have the time to invest in re-architecting, but it just needs to get done now. It is interesting, though, that they talk about it, right? Because containers are not enough. No, they're not, right? Because if you just go, oh, look, RDS, great. That's not cloud native. Aurora kind of is. NoSQL databases are a lot better in that. And then it talks about cloud native services and tools. And then it starts talking about CI/CD, which used to be my bag, but Johannes is rather better at that than I am, I think.
Yeah, I'm not sure. So I think this article, when I read it, it kind of sounded like, yeah, clickbait, but then at the end, there's no real conclusion in it, right? Some of the things that they painted for me was not like what I believe that is the right thing when modernizing the applications. And I think I recently wrote an article about that in another blog that I can also share with you guys. The main thing for me really is you don't go to the cloud to be in the cloud. And that's something that a lot of articles do kind of wrong, right? You need to have a specific purpose. And if you want to go to a public cloud and modernize the application, then just putting things into microservices and putting them into containers will not really help you, right? And that's kind of what the article tries to outline. So I did not really like this article from that perspective, right? Very honest, right? Yes, the automation pieces are important, but they come as a step 4, right? And that's for me wrong. You need to start with automating your stuff, and then you can think about automation. And then you can think about modernizing your stuff, because without automation, any modernization will actually also fail, right? Because you will still fall in the same cracks as before, where you have manual steps involved, where you need to think about how do I provision this container, how do I update this instance of a container, and these kind of things. So for me, the order is a little bit wrong in the way that they outline this, right? Containers on the one side can be a way towards modernization, because they can make things easier if you don't feel natively working lambdas, building lambdas and stuff like that, right?
It's
Go ahead,
an interesting
John.
take. Yeah, it's an interesting take. It's my cat's jumped on the desk again. Jeez, it's such a limelight hog. It's an interesting take, because you're not wrong. I've seen bad microservices architectures every day of the week, right? It's, oh, we use microservices. Yes, but you still have this controller in the middle that's pulling everything. So what you have is a split monolith. It's not microservices. You know, if that dies, everything dies. If this service dies, everything dies. So it's just a split monolith.
Yeah.
So yeah, you're not wrong. It's not the be all and end all. And I would kind of agree with your point around reordering it, because one of the quicker wins from this, I would say, is go databases first, right? Because Aurora, done, move on.
Yeah. And the last step that they call out as step 6, right? I think that needs to be on the same level as the others, right? Because you cannot say modernization without changing the way that you deliver and the way that you work on software, right? So they call that out as point number 6 in the article. For me, no, that's where you need to start thinking about, how do I want to build software going forward? How do I want to push software going forward if I want to modernize, right? So that's kind of that's what I said, right? The article was a good read, but for me, and sorry, Carl, I know that you picked it, right? For me, there is a lot of things that I would have done different when trying to explain that modernization approach.
You don't have to like the articles, Johannes. We quite often tear them to bits. They're just discussion points, right? So we're not necessarily here to promote the articles. We're just here to talk about them. One thing I did like about Step 6, though, is I actually learned a new acronym. STOSA was a new one on me. That's a 5-letter acronym. If you've listened to the podcast before, you know I love my acronyms. I've built my entire career just on acronyms and knowing what they stand for. So I've got a new acronym in the bank, STOSA.
That's how you become CEO, you know?
Exactly, yeah.
I thought you did that just by starting a business.
No. You need to know all acronyms, John, and then you one day get promoted.
Yeah, you can't start a business in IT unless you've got a good vocabulary of acronyms in your brain, unfortunately. So
This is
Yeah,
where I
and
ask you what ASDA stands for, or used to stand for, Carl.
no, I don't know what ASDA stands for because it's not an IT acronym, and I'm not sure whether this is a lead in for a joke or not.
No,
um,
not really. It's Associated Dairies.
Well, I've always known since very, very young age, pre-internet, what LASER stands for. Light amplification by stimulated emission of radiation. It was in a book of 1001 question and answers that I got for Christmas at age about 6, and
whoa.
I memorized it. So I guess this
They had books
ability.
when you were 6?
Yeah, they had books, no computers,
Have
just
they done the
books.
printing press yet?
It was you used to get annuals at Christmas. I don't know if you're too young for that, John, but every Christmas,
Oh, I think I got
everybody
football
brought
annual
out
once.
an annual, and it was like a hardback book, and you would always get several annuals for Christmas. So that's where I learned what LASER stood for, and that was the beginning of my acronym memorizing career. So there we go.
Awesome. So you can talk to Dave Itzbitsky. He runs the developer podcast from AWS as well, right? He's also a fan of acronyms if you listen to it. And I've recently recorded with him as well. He's really also as good as that.
Yeah,
that'd be great.
I love making up my own acronyms as well, and we're going on a motorbike tour later this year, and I've made up an acronym for that. My biker mates, we call ourselves Team Flossie, and we're doing the UK ACT Adventure Country Tracks. So it's Flossie UK Adventure Country Tracks. I'm not going to say the acronym out loud because it sounds rude. Anyway, moving swiftly on to the next article we're going to talk about today. Sorry about that. So moving swiftly on, the next article is from the AWS Compute blog. And it is about understanding techniques to reduce AWS Lambda costs in serverless applications. So, John, you love Lambda. We know that Lambda is a cost-effective way to run your services in AWS. But you, like all AWS services, you can spend more on it than you need to. So let's take a look at some of the ways in which you can make sure that your Lambdas are cost optimized.
So this is a fun one. As every time it comes up, I like to get the plug in that I'm a community builder in the serverless category. So this is my bag. This is absolutely my bag. And some of the tools in this I've used before, which is also fun.
But,
so yeah,
come on, there's a but.
Yeah, I mean, there's always a but. But I'm usually sitting on it. So yeah. It's a fun one, right? Because 90% of Lambda deployments that I've come across, and there's a smattering of them, don't breach the free tier. So kind of why bother, right? Well, you're bothering not for cost reasons. You're bothering for optimization reasons. Because you could, in theory, just turn the wheel and give everything 5 gig of memory and go, that'll do. And it'll probably work and it'll be fine. But you're using more of that free tier than you need to, or you might actually start breaching that free tier. Or if you're actually using a lot of this, which some of our customers are, I think one of them has got a deployment of something like 200 Lambdas in .NET, which is probably not the fastest executing thing out there. So it's important to get this right. Some of the tooling out there is AWS backed and some of it isn't. So the Lambda Power Tuner isn't. It's an open source project and I've used it before. It's where the very nice graph from the article comes from. And what it does is it overlays execution time with execution cost. You deploy this tool into your account, ideally in your dev account. It deploys a step function and you run that step function. You give it the ARN of the Lambda, whether you want to run x86 or Graviton, and the various memory points you want it to test. It goes off, it runs all of them, collects all the data into, I think, a Dynamo table, sends it off somewhere else, spits out a URL, and you can go to that URL and you get that very pretty graph. And it gives you the point where your lines intersect is probably your close to where your kind of numbers are going to be pretty good, or where your lines are quite close to each other, right? Because it's overlaying cost on one axis with time on the other, and you can just ramp all the numbers up and you get the fastest execution time, or you can have the lowest execution cost, and you kind of want somewhere in the middle of that. What they did do, and it's not spoken about here, but it does talk about Graviton, is that tool also has a way of saying, do you want to run Graviton or do you want to run x86? Because some workloads aren't great for Graviton. Lots of them are brilliant. Anything that's high I/O or compute bound, love it. The odd thing isn't, I found, that tended to be image manipulation, where it was kind of more GPU bound. It really struggled there. But yeah, so that's the first one. And I do find it interesting that they talk about it because it's not an AWS tool. So this is personal growth on behalf of the blog, I think. And the other one is the compute optimizer. And the compute optimizer just kind of runs. It's on everything, runs all the time. You have to turn it on, but it is what it is. And that sits there in the background and takes a few days, and it will eventually give you some information on your over or under provisioned, but it won't give you that nice pretty graph and that immediate upfront data that's kind of useful. So yeah, that's my brain dump on that.
Yeah, I'm gonna kind of, so first of all, I think the article is not in the more detailed level. So James has already written articles that were in more details. This kind of keeps it a little bit high level. There is 100 different possibilities on how to optimize Lambda. And in this case, kind of it touches on a few points, right? So you can optimize for costs even better, even more if you look at cold starts and these kind of things, right? There's also Lambda Power Tools, an open source project that is also kind of run by AWS, or at least by Ricardo, that does Power
Tools is a funny one because it varies depending on the language.
That's true. That's true. Still, you can use it for helping you to do the right cost optimizations, right? But for me, the most important question that stands out here, right, is why do I, as a serverless developer, need to think about this? Why cannot the platform do this for me, right? So AWS has so much AI tools. They could just find out what is the right sizing for my application, for my Lambda function, and this will be different for Python than it will be for TypeScript, than it will be for Java, right? And from my perspective, AWS can or should build this in for me, right? In terms of not forcing it, but
I'm not sure
guiding it.
Yeah, guiding is probably the right term, right? And I guess that's what they're trying to do with the compute optimization, with the whatever it's called. I think that's what it's called.
Compute optimizer.
Yeah, that one. But I think it takes too long. But then, how many executions does it need to get data and all that kind of thing? When you use, say, the Power Tuner, it's running, I think, by default 10 executions of every memory point that you put in it. So you could get 100 executions fairly quickly and get some good data. So that, I think, is the difference. Of course, the Power Tuner has this distinct problem, and I have this, where if you're calling downstream APIs or databases or whatever that can't scale very quickly, then it will just bottleneck up and you've got to go and do it the hard way.
But that's what I expect from the management layer, right? So from my perspective, they could build in something that uses AI to recognize how your Lambda function behaves based on the input and stuff like that, and then right size it automatically for you, right? And then you would also pay for that pieces only, right? And I know that that's maybe too much of an ask, and that takes away another thing that we can use to deliver better software, right? But having this included as part of and then, I don't know, optimizing it once per hour, or optimizing it once every 30 minutes, right? Or at least providing your input on how to optimize it, right? That would already help a lot of people that are not as detailed as you are, John.
Well, I mean, I only am, because I moved from platform engineering to serverless development, and I kind of sit sort of in the middle of that. So that's kind of why I do this. It is a good point, though, because the strapline, the tagline for Lambda was run code without thinking about servers. Well, you're not thinking about servers, but you're still thinking about infrastructure. You're still thinking about resources. So it is a very good point.
Cool. Well, on that good piece of agreement there, on that good point, let's segue nicely onto the next article we wanted to talk
also,
about today.
don't use Java.
I'm not sure about that, John. Let's discuss about that offline. So I had a great talk yesterday on my meetup. So I run an AWS meetup as well, where Vadim, another community builder, was talking about Lambda cold starts and snap start and that kind of stuff, right? And even so, you might not like Java, right? There's still people like me who like to use it because they feel comfortable, and they have used it for a few years. And it also takes away a lot of burden, right, from my perspective. But as I said, that's maybe when we have a Snapstart article, Carl, you can bring me back into the show, and then we can have a conversation and a debate on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure we will. So, let's move on to the next article for today, though, which is about Bedrock. Nothing to do with the Flintstones, nor the John Digweed house music label. This is
Now you're showing
actually
your
a. This is actually John Digweed's still going, but he has had some plastic surgery. I don't know if you've seen John Digweed lately, or if you even know who I'm talking about. But go and have a look online at pictures of John Digweed from back in the day and how he looks now, and draw your own opinions. Anyway, we're actually here to talk about Amazon's Bedrock, which is a game-changing AI cloud service powering the future of tech. Interesting one, this. Obviously huge amounts of press at the moment about AI, ChatGPT grabbing most of the headlines, etc. This is not really a ChatGPT competitor necessarily, more of a foundation, hence I guess the name Bedrock, for other people to go and build services like ChatGPT. What are your thoughts on this one, guys?
I've used some of the managed services in the AI space before, but obviously this is brand new, so I have no major comment on that. The ones I've used before, things like recognition and stuff that just use pre-baked models and you just kind of hit an API and say, tell me what's here, please. This is an interesting one. I think you're right that it's not a ChatGPT competitor, but it would be a competitor for the thing that ChatGPT is running on, is I think where this market is.
So my thoughts on this one are, they announced too early, but they did better than Google. So Google released something into the wild which was not ready to go. Amazon, on the other side, made a big press around, we are doing things even better and blah, 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 blah. They announced something, but no one can use it. So for me, this at the moment, it's useless. Until we can actually get our hands on it and play around with it, no one can say where this is going to go, right? At the end, what they said, as far as I understood the press releases, they are going to give us builders the tools at hand to build something like ChatGPT if we want to, or do whatever we want with that. But unless we start playing around with it, it's not really helpful to anyone, right? And I think that's where the cruise is going to be, right? How much are we going to pay? How can we get access to it? How can we interact with it? How can we provision it in the infrastructure and all of these kind of stuff? They haven't answered that, which is why I think that they announced this to do something like a Me Too, but at least 3 months too early. But that's my personal take. So, don't know, Carl. Would you have done the same thing?
I don't know. It's difficult, isn't it? I mean, perhaps I think what you're getting at is it's a Me Too article. Everyone else is getting a lot of coverage in this space. So, we've also got something, we need to be out there talking about it. So, yeah, perhaps that very much is the case here. But it also kind of segues quite neatly into our last article about AWS growth. And there's some very conservative forecasts about AWS's growth, perhaps being only 6% this year in terms of year-on-year revenue growth, whereas the previous year, I think it was something like 22% year-on-year.
Yeah, and they complained
growth.
about that too.
Yeah, growth is slowing, but as we've said before, John, these are still enormous numbers. 6% on top of 80 billion is another $5 billion, which is still a massive amount of growth. But the reason I kind of segued into that article is, Johannes, you made a great point before we came on air, that the Bedrock is a potential growth opportunity for AWS. Perhaps the media strategy is to counter some of this negative press around the growth slowing, to say, hey, maybe the growth is slowing, but look, guys, we've got plenty of other stuff in the pipeline for you.
Yeah, on the other side, slowing down to 6% is what other people would love to get, right? So I think it's even seeing that number decrease, right? It might, from an investor's perspective, it might look bad, right? But there's other people that are cutting people at 50%, right? There's other people that are stopping business because they see the economic go down. So I think AWS should stop. Well, investors of AWS should also stop complaining about that. We somehow need to right-size the mindset as well, right? Someday the cloud growth will stop be over 20%, right? Why? Because most of the things will be in the cloud, and we cannot move everything into the cloud again, right? And I think that they will come, right, someday. And it might be this year, it might be next year, we don't know, but somehow we'll reach that.
I think the other thing is there's a huge push for modernization, and all of this modernization that we're talking about, cloud native services inherently cost less than running your VMs in the cloud. So if you are going from VMs to containers, that's less revenue for the cloud provider. If you are going from containers to serverless, that's less revenue for the cloud provider. But actually, the cloud provider is providing a huge amount more value to your business. So those services become much stickier. So although the revenue growth is slowing, the revenue that is there is stickier revenue for the
It's
providers.
funny you say that, because fairly recently, tangent, the UK Competition and Markets Authority said that they're investigating the big three cloud providers because of how sticky their services are, cost of switching, cost of entrance for new players, and all that kind of thing. So, yeah, I've always been on the multi-cloud is a nonsense. Changing regions is hard enough. Just pick one and go all in. Yes, I'm quoting Corey Quinn a little bit, but I do share the opinion. If you're not taking advantage of the cloud native and the serverless services, you are shooting yourself in the foot. So I'll be very interested to see what the CMA come out with. But you're not wrong. It's less revenue, but it's stickier revenue. It's more recurring revenue. It's not, oh, I need a server for the next 10 minutes. Pff, it's here, I'm running everything in Lambdas, and they run fundamentally differently than Google Cloud Functions, for instance.
Yeah, on the other side, I've seen a few articles talking about we're moving off the cloud. So I don't know if that's a thing, right?
We rail against cloud repatriation articles because they get, I rail against them because they get a lot more noise than it's actually worth. I can think of 3 actual examples of people doing cloud repatriation, and that was Dropbox storage, that was Zynga, who you may or may not have heard of, but they do lots of mobile games and stuff, and they were getting hammered by egress fees. And whoever it was we spoke about the last time, it was last week, I think we spoke about it, and I forget who they were because they were just forgettable. But the 37 Signals, that was them. And they've had good reasons for doing it, but it's very much not a thing. It's not a theme. So
I think so too, especially if you look at the developers, right, that really get into doing serverless and removing abstractions, right? So I'm really not sure, right? So coming back to the article, right? I think 6% growth is good. We should stop. AWS should stop moaning about that, right? They should get more people in AWS to support us builders, and instead of getting people out of the organization, right? But that's just, as I said, my personal thoughts, yeah, they should be pretty happy.
it's funny because every engineer I've ever spoken to has had a similar sort of opinion. It's the market has this voracious appetite for growth, and builders just want to build things. And it's kind of the traditional business versus the listed business. The traditional business, we build things, we make things, we sell things. We're quite
That's
happy
true.
with that. We're making
Yeah.
some money. We might be growing a little bit, we might not be growing, but everyone's getting paid. Great.
That's yeah. And now, John, I think it's the right time. Let's talk about your salary increases over the last 2 years. Was it more than 22%?
I've
Okay.
I've got pop.
I don't think John's ever stayed in a job for more than a year. Anyway,
I've done 2 years.
Okay. On that note, we have unfortunately come to the end of our time for today's episode. So we'll wrap up there. Thank you very much for your input, Johannes. Very insightful. Thanks as always to John as well. So that was season 2, episode 15 of LogiCast. We'll be back next week with another episode for you. Thanks for listening.